Hello and welcome. My name is Professor David Jones, and I'm Director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, which is the National Centre for Research into Healthcare Ethics for the Catholic Church in the UK and Ireland, indeed. And this is the first of a series of presentations on healthcare ethics, and we're starting with something on the human person. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights me not, no, nor woman neither, though by your smiling you seem to think so. That's Shakespeare, by the way. The human person, what a piece of work is a human person. Why start with this for a topic, for a course in healthcare ethics? Well, as healthcare is healthcare, it is care of persons by persons. It is about human action, action of persons. Doctors are persons. And as it's healthcare, it's care of persons in respect to their life, human life, and their death, their health and their sickness, their minds and their bodies. So it's persons as doctors as persons, patients as persons. You can't ask the question, what is it to be a good doctor, without asking, what is it to be a good person in your acting. You can't ask what it is to respect patients without asking, what is a human person, such that they merit respect, if they do merit respect. Similarly, you can't talk about the sanctity of life, at least not within the context of medicine, without thinking about the sanctity of specifically human life, even though we might want to think about the meaning or the worthwhileness of other forms of life in other contexts. Medicine is primarily about the life of human persons, and the sanctity of life we're talking about is the sanctity of human life. Similarly, healthcare ethics, at least sometimes, involves asking the question, when does human life begin? Or when does a person begin? As an embryo, or as an unborn child later in development, or as a newborn infant, or when I have my first memories, which is long after I was born. And similarly, we might ask occasionally, when does life end? Has my life ended when my social networks and my ability to contribute has ended, when I've lost my social position, or when I have a terminal illness, or perhaps when I've lost consciousness and it can't be retrieved, or with what is called brain stem death, which is an important part of the ethics of transplant medicine. To answer such questions, we have to know what it is we're talking about, which is beginning or ending. What is a human person, such as we ask the question, has it begun? What is human life, such as we ask, has it ended? So it seems sensible to start a course on healthcare ethics by asking a fundamental question, what is a human person? So I want to start with something obvious. Aristotle said, in a way, matter is obvious stuff. And I want to start with a quotation from Richard Dawkins, partly because Dawkins has a flair for very vivid metaphors, and he's a kind of thinker who, if he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. He's very helpful for challenging. And this is a quotation from, I think it's from A Selfish Gene. Quote, "We are survival machines." And by we, we do not just mean people. A monkey is a machine that preserves genes up a tree. A fish is a machine that preserves genes in the water. So living things are just vehicles, mechanisms, machines for preserving genes, for preserving sequences of DNA. This is, in a way, a modern idea. Genes are a modern idea in this sense. But it goes back to the idea of us as machines goes back at least to the kind of mechanistic philosophy of the 18th century, where they had their elegant clocks and their elegant mathematical physics, and people were very interested in machines. And so Julien Offray Lametrie, mid-18th century, said, "Let us then conclude boldly that man is a machine, and that in the whole universe there is but a single substance, differently modified. So there is just material stuff, which is modified into different shapes and movement and mechanisms, and the human being is a mechanism." This is a quotation from the book L'Homme Machine, the human being, the machine, so the clue is in the title. And this is the beginning of, we think it is a modern idea, but this is in the 18th century. And indeed, you can trace it back further. This is a quotation from Democritus, who's an ancient atomist. "The first principles of everything are atoms and empty space. Everything else is merely thought to exist." So nothing else exists apart from atoms in motion. Everything else is merely thought to exist. Fire, water, air, earth, even these are conglomerations of given atoms. So also is the soul. So even what it is that makes us, which makes human beings human, which it derives thought and life, even that is just matter in motion, atoms in motion. This is a conception of the person, a way of thinking about human beings. All of these examples, very modern, Dawkins, what's called early modern, sometimes 18th century, and ancient, they're all forms of what's sometimes called reductionism. So you reduce, you think that it's the experience is reducible to certain things, to matter. Modern philosophers sometimes call this nothing buttery. It's nothing but this or nothing but that. We are nothing but atoms. We are nothing but machines. We are nothing but matter. Beware, I mean, one way to detect this in a thinker or philosopher, the word merely. So the difference between I am a body and I am merely a body, or only, merely, nothing but. These are ways of saying the physicality you have is exhaustive, and that's all you need to think about in order to understand a human being. And it's dismissive of all other material. A human being, a human person is not a who, it's just a machine inside a bigger machine. And it's useful to see this idea straight on, because it is an influential idea. And even if we deny it, it might still influence us in some ways. And it might still influence, say, the delivery of healthcare. The human being as a machine, the doctor as a machine, the patient as a machine. So, it's a quotation from Popper, but I'll go a step back a step first. Even philosophically speaking, even thinking of it as a philosophy, approach to philosophy, there is something rather unsatisfying about characterizing material beings, living beings in particular, as reducible to the stuff of which they're made. If you imagine, as a thought experiment, please do not try this at home, if you imagine taking a living frog and putting it into a blender, there used to be lots of sick jokes when I was a kid about this kind of stuff. Anyway, you imagine taking a frog and putting it in a blender. What you have afterwards, liquidized frog, has the same atoms, it has the same chemicals. The chemicals start to change very rapidly, but it has basically the same material composition as the frog. Nearly everything that is interesting about a frog has ceased. There's no catching flies, running around, making tadpoles. The frogness of the frog is it doesn't have a particular species. No doubt you could say something about the species the frog was from the liquidized frog. You could do an analysis of it. But what is interesting about the frog is no longer there. Because what is interesting about the frog is not just the stuff of which it is made, but the form of its life. And that's true even of a frog, let alone of people. Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a rather bad-tempered and eccentric philosopher, but who had some insights particularly about views he was criticizing, said, "Materialism is the philosophy of the subject who forgets to take account of himself." Materialism is the philosophy of the person who forgets to take account of himself. So people look out at the material world and they forget that they are looking at it, and they forget things that they know well from their own experience. Materialism as a kind of self-denial. The ethical importance, and now I come back to my quotation here, the ethical importance of seeing a human person as more than matter is expressed very well, I think, by a 20th century philosopher called Karl Popper. Popper was not a religious believer, so this is not a quotation from someone who practiced a religious faith, but he was an opponent of various totalitarian philosophies. He was an opponent of fascism, he was an opponent of communism, he was an opponent of those kinds of philosophies which reduced people to cogs in machines, that saw people as masses rather than the worth of the individual. And this is Popper sort of railing against totalitarianism. Quote, "Every time a man dies, a whole universe is destroyed. One realizes this when one identifies with that man. Human beings are irreplaceable, and in being irreplaceable, they are clearly different from machines. They are capable of enjoying life, they are capable of suffering, and of facing death consciously. They are selves, they are ends in themselves, as Kant says." So this is a real in-your-face denial of materialism as an adequate philosophy, not just adequate for understanding frogs, but adequate ethically if we're going to take people seriously, and if we're going to identify ourselves with other people. A whole universe dies. One realizes this when one identifies with that. When one doesn't identify, it's just a statistic. It's just another body. But when one identifies with that person, when one sees that something else is going on, the person is not just reducible to the statistic, to the body. So this belief that the person is... Do you want to stop?
Yeah. You can start again with "so this person lives in the same."
Thank you. This belief that a person is more than just matter has a long philosophical history, going back at least to Plato, the philosopher Plato, who is in a way the foundation of Western philosophy. In the modern world, it was expressed famously by the philosopher René Descartes, who argued that even if we can doubt everything, we at least know that we exist, because if we didn't exist, we wouldn't be doubting. And we at least know that we're thinking, because if we weren't thinking, we wouldn't be thinking about whether we were existing or not. And that's what he meant by the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Cogito ergo sum. Whatever else I know that I exist. And I know that I exist because I'm thinking. And therefore I know that I'm a thinking thing as one of the first fundamental things that I know. So it's a kind of starting point for Descartes. So it's not just something which is an add-on, it's where I start when I think about myself. And this centrality of thought or self-awareness, me as a thinking thing, us as human beings as thinking beings, has is expressed by the English philosopher John Locke in his definition of what is a human person. So this is bringing me back. So Descartes was a kind of starting point for philosophy, but John Locke used the perspective of Descartes, or something very close to the perspective of Descartes, to define what a human being is, what a person is, rather. And he says, for us to be persons, not just to be animals, not just to be bodies, for us to be persons, someone to be a person is to be a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection, and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. So he was thinking about memory and looking forwards, planning, looking back, looking forward, and about a sort of continuity of memory, and also what makes someone the same person. What makes you the same person as your memories? Sometimes we have false memories. We think we were doing something and it wasn't us, what makes a memory a true memory of me is that what makes it me is it's really an awareness of the same person over time. And this focus on us as being aware, human beings as aware, you might say this is refreshing in comparison to, say, Dawkins and Democritus and Lemaitre. They're saying we're just machines, but people like Locke and Descartes and Popper say, no, we're not just machines. We're essentially aware of ourselves. That's key to who we are. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand what it is to be a person. And so you might think this is a helpful way to approach healthcare ethics. That is to say, if you hadn't read any, you might think that. However, it comes with a big philosophical health warning, and a good person to exemplify this is a philosopher called John Harris. This is a living philosopher, someone who teaches in Manchester, and I'll just read the quotation. Once a new human individual comes into existence, she will gradually move from being a potential or pre-person into an actual person when she becomes capable of valuing her own existence. And it is very difficult to say precisely when this is. If eventually she permanently loses this capacity, she will have ceased to be a person. So you can see how this idea of a person becoming a person, so a human being, the animal which is a human being, becomes a person and might stop being a person. This flows from Locke's idea of what a person is. Because if a person is a being who's aware, then if you're not aware, maybe you're not a person. Or if you couldn't be aware. And more worrying still, and stated explicitly by John Harris, non-persons or potential persons cannot be wronged by killing them, because death does not deprive them of anything that they can value. So not only do we suddenly have a category of the human non-person, but the human non-person turns out not to be protected against being killed because not capable of valuing their life. So there's at least one strand of philosophy, and this is somebody who teaches medical ethics, who's a professor of medical ethics, who's the editor of a notable journal. So this represents a strand of thinking in modern medical ethics, a strand of thinking which derives in some ways from Locke and philosophers like Locke, and who says, yes, we're not just reducible to bodies, we are essentially persons. But what that means is, not everybody counts as a person. Not every body counts as a person. Not every human body. Not every living human body. So where does that leave us? We don't. If we have problems with Dawkins and reductive materialism, but also a problem with the sort of coming apart of the person and the human being, the sort of splitting that we have in John Harris. Well, a key a way forward from this dilemma is as often with dilemmas is to go neither way, to choose neither, and say, well, those philosophers from Plato to Descartes who say that we're not just material, we're not reducible to material, they're saying a good thing when they say that, but we don't have to therefore buy into saying that what the person is a separate thing from the body, or could be separated from, at least in this life. And so we don't have to be dualist or think. This is a philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, early 20th century philosopher, and he mocked Descartes and Descartes' view of a human being, and he said Descartes thinks that a human being is a ghost trapped inside a machine. So what we are essentially is persons who are disconnected from this body, which is a machine. And Gilbert Ryle said, no, it is neither the case that the body is a machine, nor it is the case that we are a ghost trapped inside a machine. Man need not be degraded to a machine by being denied to be a ghost in a machine. So when he said we should get rid of the ghost in the machine, not to leave us with a machine, but to not have a machine at all, but to have something which is material, but which has a transcendent element to it, but is one being. And this attempt of Gilbert Ryle to oppose dualism, early modern kind of dualism, could be seen as a kind of restoration, in a way, of an early Christian philosopher, and one of the first people to give a definition of a human person, and that was Boethius. And Boethius said a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. And so, by saying he's an individual substance of a rational nature, he means what we are is one thing. We're a kind of thing, a substance, who have a nature, and our nature is to be rational. But just because we're not always thinking, it doesn't mean we have a different nature. We don't turn into something else. So there's a sense of nature there, so that the person isn't separate from the human being. Boethius, in giving this definition, was also influenced by Aristotle. Boethius was a kind of an Aristotelian philosopher. And Aristotle said a couple of things. He said that a human being is a rational animal. Actually, he didn't quite say that, but lots of people thought he said that. So lots of Aristotelians, the typical Aristotelian definition of a human being is a rational animal. So an animal which is rational. But the rationality of an animal is part of its nature, even if it's not always exercised. In the same way that we are mammals, human beings are mammals. The definition of a mammal is a kind of animal that suckles its young. Mammary, that's what mammal means. I can't suckle my young, but I still count as a mammal, thanks to other members of the human species who can. So things which are part of our nature, which define our nature in a way, are not always exercised by all of us, and are not always exercised by those of us who do exercise them all the time. And that's also true of our rationality, that we gradually come into to have these capacities, and we might sometimes be impeded in having them, but they're still part of us because of our nature. And even when we exercise them or not, that doesn't change the kind of animal we are. We are, by definition, a rational animal. Another thing he said, which is a bit more mysterious, is the soul is the form of the human body, by which he meant the soul, the principle of life, is like the sort of dynamic shape of the body. And this goes back in a way to the frog. What makes the frog a living frog is something to do with its living shape. And it's characteristic, the life of a frog is characteristic of the species of a frog, of the particular shape that life has. A different way of saying that, turning it on its head perhaps, is what Wittgenstein said: the human body is the best picture of the human soul. The human body is the best picture of the human soul, because when we ask what a soul is, it seems rather mysterious to think of what souls are. But then when we see somebody who's alive, when we see their face, we think, oh, that's a living human being. And even when we think of souls in heaven, as Catholics think of souls in heaven, or in hell, or in purgatory, and we paint pictures, what do we paint pictures of? Bodies of people. That's the picture we have. That's the only picture we have. The living, we see the soul in the life of the body. Even our rational life is in a way interwoven with the kind of life that we have. So I was going to say something about Kant, but I won't because of time. Kant said lots of things. So to summarise, I'm going to have two goes at summarising, but this is my first summary. We might say, what is a human person? This talk is about what human persons are. Well, what we are animals of a particular kind, and we're born with a specific nature. I might even say conceived with a specific nature. Before we're born, we have a specific nature, We're animals of a particular kind. We're not ghosts. But part of our nature is that we have a capacity to transcend our materiality. So we're not just the material stuff of which we're made. We're not reducible to the material stuff of which we're made. So on the one hand, that we are physical and bodies and animals, and on the other hand, the animals which we are animals which transcend themselves or have the capacity to. Thirdly, there are many kinds of dualities. The body and soul is a way of expressing the duality, but you can also express this duality in different ways, and then you come up with something different. So if you talk about mind and body, that sounds slightly different, and because people also think about the mind and the emotions, that sounds different. Sometimes the human being as caused and the human being as free, that's another way in which people make a difference, a kind of duality. And sometimes these dualities are unhelpful, but often what they're doing is they're picking out aspects of our nature which are interesting and worth looking at and are complementary. But they're also not, I mean, this is just something to think about, they're not all the same thing. So when we split, when we cut in various ways, first of all, when we cut, we're doing so in our heads, notionally. Real people aren't cut. We cut them up enough, then they're not living people anymore. But living people, there's something about a living person which is a unity, which has different aspects, but we can sometimes separate out in our heads the different aspects. But those different aspects are part of a single unified reality, which is the reality of the human person. So you have different aspects: the soul and the body, the freedom and the being caused, the mind and the physicality. And that was a place where I stopped when I first gave this talk. But then, as a result of interaction with the benefit of teaching, you learn more by teaching than you do by reading. And that's because people ask you questions, and then you think, actually, that's true. There are things that I hadn't thought about. We come to, even when you read, you learn by reading together. That's what college means, co-lecturing. You read together. Somebody said, well, the problem, it's true that we're dualities, and it's true with duality of mind and body, but even thinking in that way, if I had stopped in that way, it would be possible to make another mistake, and that would be the mistake of thinking of the individual, the human being, as an individual, as having these dualities in themselves as an individual, but not in relation to other persons. But there is another but in terms of the multiple aspects, another important aspect, as important as these other aspects, is the way in which persons are defined both as individuals and in relationships to other people, to other persons. And this is true even in the way in which the word person comes to us, which is actually from theology. So Boethius, who gave us this definition of the person, was thinking about the person of Christ, and was thinking about the persons of the Trinity. That's what he was talking about, that's what he was writing about when he wrote about the person. And our idea of persons, even though John Harris might not acknowledge it or might not even recognise it, in fact is influenced by not just Christianity, but by specific doctrines of Christianity, by the Trinity and the Incarnation. And what Thomas Aquinas said of the Trinity is the persons are distinguished from one another by their relations. So what makes the persons distinct is their relationship with one another. What makes the Father is that he is related to the Son, and the Son because he's related to the Father. That's what makes the Father. So the relationship defines and also distinguishes the persons. Now, in an analogous way, the Catholic tradition has struggled both to resist totalitarianism, just as Popper did, so also the Catholic Church has struggled to resist the views of society which subjugates the individual, but at the same time has struggled to resist forms of individuality, forms of individualism which say we're just understood, we can be understood completely in ourselves as individuals. That you can understand what a human being is, taking an individual human being without thinking that there were ever any other human beings than just one. This has implications for the social and political world, but also for healthcare ethics. In debates about abortion, for example, people often focus on, is the fetus a person, or is the fetus not a person? Is the fetus, what is the status of the fetus as a human being or not? But if we are to understand rightly the ethics of pregnancy and the ethics of abortion, then it's important to understand the unborn child in the child's relationship to his or her mother. Indeed, part of the recognition of the humanity is the recognition of this as the child of a mother and a father, of the child in relationship. Though sometimes it's people who are in favour of abortion who wish to reduce the child only to what our views might be projected on the child, whether the child is wanted or not. So if the child is not wanted, it's not a child. Nevertheless, and some people therefore wishing to resist this want to reduce the question just to, is it a human being or not? Actually, there's something correct in saying, well, what is the relationship to that child? Is the question, the phrase, every child should be a wanted child, is true, is certainly true. But the implication of that is not that unwanted children should not be, but that children should not be unwanted. But the question of the relationship of the child, both to the mother and to wider society, and the relationship of wider society to the mother, is essential to understanding the situation that the woman finds herself in, and the ways in which we engage with this issue as with other issues. So there is a problem sometimes, I think, of being, even as Catholics, sometimes too individualist. End with a quotation from Edith Steiner, Catholic philosopher, and nun and saint who died in Auschwitz. Empathy, she wrote a very important work on empathy. Empathy is no longer to consider my own 0 point as the 0 point, but as a spatial point among many. That is to say, to think of, in one way, if you go back to Popper, he said that a death of one person is the death of the whole world. And that is an important insight. But the problem with it is you might think, well, therefore what we should be, we should all think of ourselves as being the centre of the whole world. And that's not quite true. That's not quite true. What is true is that we are worlds in relation with other worlds. So we are a unique perspective on the world, but in relation to other worlds, to other persons. And to understand that is an essential part of ethics, an essential part of empathy. So where does that get us? Well, it gets us that we are animals of a particular kind, with a specific nature. We have an inborn capacity to transcend our materiality. We have many different kinds of dualities. And again, the individual and the communal is another example of these dualities, which are both aspects of us. And we are neither mere parts of society, nor isolated monads, isolated things in themselves, but we are persons in relationship. And that's what it is to be a person. It's often difficult to hold these things together, and therefore it is a benefit to be a Catholic, because the Church often helps in various ways by its teaching, by its teaching on many things, by its guidance. This is a piece of teaching from the Council of Vienne in the late Middle Ages. And they were debating about the human person and the questions about the resurrection and the separation of the soul. And the Council of Vienne used the language of Aristotle, the language of form, and said, we define that anyone who presumes henceforth to assert defend or hold stubbornly. Heresy is only stubborn error. Everybody has error, but you have to be stubborn to be heretic. Defend or hold stubbornly that the rational or intellectual soul is the form of the human body, of itself and essentially, is to be considered a heretic.
Is not. You just misread that, David.
All right. Is not. So that's laughing at my own joke is always a mistake. We define that anyone who presumes henceforth to assert, defend, or hold stubbornly that the rational and intellectual soul is not the form of the human body, of itself and essentially, is to be considered a heretic. To put that in a positive phrase, the rational and intellectual soul is the form of the body, and it's not a Catholic thing to deny that. You don't have to use that language, but if you use that language, you can't deny that. What makes us rational or spiritual, and what makes us living bodies, is the same principle, the principle of the soul. So the soul that gives life to me is the soul that gives life to my body, and the soul that gives life to my mind and to my spirit. It's one soul. I'm one being, and that's Catholic doctrine. This is my favourite council. This is a bit earlier, and this is the Creed of Lateran IV, and in the bit of the Creed of Lateran IV expands on the Nicene Creed. And so when the Nicene Creed says, "And God created everything visible and invisible," it says, "The creator of all things, invisible and visible, spiritual and corporeal, angelic, namely, and mundane, and then human, as it were, common, composed of spirit and body." Not actually, but as it were. So you have the spiritual world, which is created by God, including the angels. You have the physical world that's created by God. And you also have the human world, which is, as it were, something of one and something of the other. Like frogs, actually. Amphibians. We live in two different kinds of life. In the water and in the air, as bodies and spirits. As it were, composed of both. So this reminds us of trying to hold the things together, trying to hold our body and spirit together. I'll end with a quotation from Chesterton, not talking about this issue, but an analogous issue. Here again, in short, Christianity got over the difficulty of combining furious opposites by keeping them both furious. So he says, typically, people who make mistakes, either sects that make mistakes or philosophies that make mistakes, they do so they focus more on one thing or they focus on another. And sometimes people are inclined to say, well, if we like one, we have to deny the other, or we have to have some kind of mushy compromise where we're not quite really physical and we're not quite really spiritual. No, we go the whole way. We grasp our physicality. We rejoice in our physicality. We have our physicality in the sacraments and in the ethical teaching of the Church and in the teaching on the resurrection, the incarnation. But at the same time, we have a view of the spiritual life, which is vivid and vibrant and real and more real than a kind of ghostly spiritual life, which is not connected to the body. So we try to have both. We are encouraged to have both, to keep both and keep both furious. And this is therefore a help of Christianity to something which is not just for Christians, because it is true of, in a way, it's one of the difficulties of philosophy since Plato and Aristotle, to try to struggle with the mystery of the human person, to try to struggle to not reduce us to material, but at the same time to not separate us off so that we're not connected, to not isolate us, but to not overemphasize the community so that subjugates us. So these things they're difficult to hold together, and philosophers have struggled to hold them together, and so also has Christianity. But Christianity at least says that's the challenge, to try to do so. To try to have an image of the human person which takes the human person seriously, as mysterious, as physical, and as therefore subject to suffering and illness and death, but also as a spiritual feeling, sensitive creature who must endure this suffering and who faces this death. And that's a challenge for all of us, because we will all die, and most of us will get sick, and most of us will have some kind of sickness which is life-threatening. But also for those who work in healthcare, it challenges in a separate way to think how to be human as carers for people who are recognising their health issues, but not thinking of them as machines to be fixed, but as people who struggle, as doctors do too. And I'll stop there.